Welcome to the Free Will Show. I'm one of your hosts, Taylor Sear.
And I'm your other host, Matt Flummer. In this episode 0, we introduce you to the show. We'll talk about who we are, what this podcast is, and why we're making it.
Sounds good. So, to say a little bit about who we are, we'll ask each other a few questions. So, Matt, why don't you ask me some questions?
Okay. Where are you from, Taylor?
I'm a Floridian. I grew up in Orlando, Florida. Went to Florida State for my undergraduate degree and stayed there for my master's degree in philosophy. I studied philosophy and religion as an undergrad and then did an MA in philosophy at Florida State. I'm sure you'll say something about this in a minute. That is how we know each other. We met there at Florida State. So I studied philosophy there. I'll say more about this in a minute, I guess. Got interested in the topic of free will in particular while doing my master's, and then did my PhD at the University of California, Riverside. Wrote a dissertation on free will. And now I am teaching at Samford University, which is in a suburb of Birmingham, Alabama. So that's a little bit about where I'm from, where I am now.
All right. Excellent. The Florida State connection will be strong. Yeah, I guess I should go next.
Yeah, I guess I should ask you a little bit about yourself.
I was waiting to see if you were going to ask me about myself.
I wanted you to ask me to ask you about yourself. So where are you from, Matt?
I am from Alabama. So we have two connections. I am from Alabama and you live in Alabama now.
That's right.
I also went to Florida State for grad school by a long circuitous route through Alabama for undergrad, master's degrees in New Orleans and St. Louis, and then finally in Tallahassee, where I wrote a dissertation more along the lines of moral responsibility than free will, but it was very free willish.
Those are very connected, as we'll see.
As we'll see, they are very connected. But
nice. And where do you teach now?
I teach at a small college in the middle of nowhere, California, where all of the citrus on the West Coast is grown. I'm looking out my window right now at a grove of Cara oranges. If you haven't had one, they are delicious.
Very nice. That's another connection because there is some citrus grown in Riverside, California. In fact, quite a bit near the university. Part of the university.
Quite a bit. I know a few farmers around here, and they've told me about some of the hybrids that have come out of UCR.
That's right. I used to walk along those groves on my way into my office.
Nice.
All right. So what's something that our listeners should know about you to get to know you a little bit more? What do you do for fun?
Well, my wife and I have a kind of like mini farm that we bought. It's a fixer-upper on a few acres with pretty amazing views of the Sierras when the air is not too bad. And since it's a fixer-upper, most of my free time is fixing stuff.
So what have you fixed recently?
Well, like I told you a few minutes ago when we were just talking, I and a friend of mine replaced some valves on our well, the plumbing that comes out of the well towards the house. So it's nice to have friends that know how to do stuff when you are fixing up stuff.
Yeah. That sounds fun. Very nice.
What about you?
As we were just talking about before, so that everyone else is privy to what we've been saying in private, very interested in science fiction, especially stories that involve time travel. So I've been reading some time travel stories lately, watching some TV series that involve time travel. I think my favorite book, I go back and forth on this, I think my favorite science fiction book is a novel by Isaac Asimov called The End of Eternity. Lots of great time travel stuff in there. Yeah,
I'll have to check that out. I've never heard of it.
You should. In a classic philosophy paper by David Lewis called Paradoxes of Time Travel, there's a footnote that references that book by Isaac Asimov, as well as a couple of other time travel stories. Yeah, highly recommend. It's a short and quick read. Yeah. So, how'd you get interested in philosophy? I know you said it's uh, a kind of interesting path to being in Tallahassee. What led you there, and how about free will in particular? What got you interested in free will and moral responsibility?
When I was working on my undergrad, I started out as a biology major in Birmingham, where you are now,
Oh my
at the
goodness.
University of Alabama. So where I started, you have ended. I had to take a philosophy course like a lot of people do in order to get my undergrad, and I took a course on contemporary moral issues, an applied ethics class. And I don't know if it was I was not a good student or my teacher was not a good teacher, probably more of the former. But I hated that class and decided that I hated philosophy after that.
Oh, okay.
And it wasn't until much later when I had a I don't know what you want to call it, a not very good job with lots of time to think, that I started thinking about the problem of evil.
Oh, okay.
And
As you were
one of the
suffering.
main, as I was suffering, yeah, one of the main, if you know anything about the problem of evil, one of the main answers or defenses against the problem of evil is the free will defense. So I started thinking about free will because of the problem of evil.
I think you're not alone. A lot of people come to think about free will in response to the problem of evil.
What about you? How did you become interested in philosophy and free will in particular?
Well, I think I was more, um, uh, I don't know, I was more into philosophy as an undergrad than you were. I wasn't turned off to it by any of my courses. I pretty much knew I wanted to study philosophy uh, from the get go at Florida State. So I think I took 4 philosophy classes my first semester at Florida State. So I just jumped into the deep end with logic and ethical theory and philosophy of mind, something else. So I think I already had a love for it when I started taking philosophy courses at Florida State. Got interested in free will in particular because, well, I guess we could say more about um, who we worked with at Florida State and what the sort of emphasis of that department is. But as a graduate student there, taking courses on moral responsibility and free will, in particular, I realized I was interested in the issues. They sort of bump up against every other area of philosophy. So we'll have to say more, I guess, about what philosophy is and then how we're thinking about free will. But it's such a sort of wide ranging issue, and it touches on a bunch of different areas in philosophy. So for that reason, it's really fun to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for people who want to get connected with you, if they are interested in reading some of the stuff that you have written, how would they
Yeah.
go about doing that?
Well, I have a website. It's just my name with my middle initial.com. So Taylor W. Sear, which is CYR .com. You can just Google Taylor Sear philosophy and it should be the first hit. Uh, so that's where I have a bit more about me and um, my research and my teaching. But I'm also on social media. You can follow me on Twitter. Same uh, handle. It's my name, Taylor W. Sear. There's also, if you are a philosopher and you're on Phil Papers or Phil People, you can find me there. So Phil Papers is a great resource for just finding out about papers that have been published in philosophy. Um, but if you're not into philosophy and you don't have an account on Phil Papers, there's also academia.edu, which I have an account there, and you can find uh, drafts of all of my published papers there for free. So there's lots of ways to connect with me. You can also just shoot me an email if you want to chat.
Nice.
What about you? Do you want to get connected with people? Do you have a way for them to get connected with you?
No, I don't. Okay, I'm just kidding.
Cool. All right. So what?
I am on Twitter, although I don't send many tweets or look at Twitter very often, but I am there. I also have
What's your handle on Twitter?
I don't even know. It's kind of sad, isn't it? I'd have to
Oh, good
look that up.
grief! I'll find you. I
Yeah, I
probably
think it's
follow
just
you.
Matthew Flummer. I do have a website as well, but it's a Weebly site. So it's just matthewflummer.weebly.com. And I don't update it very often. So I don't have much of a social media presence as much as you do.
That's all right. You're spending more time fixing up your house, and I don't do anything
Yeah,
to fix up where I live. So
true.
just my website. So, okay, cool. This is episode 0, so probably not very many people are going to listen to it. But if they're really interested in our show and about us, they can listen to it and find out a little bit more about us. But I thought it would be cool to talk a little bit more about what we're hoping for the podcast to be. So we could say a little bit more about what the podcast is and why we're making it. So I kind of quickly wrote up a little blurb about what the podcast is all about. So here's the blurb. Do any of us really have free will? What does it mean to have free will anyway? Is free will compatible with determinism? Hasn't science disproved free will? How could we ever have free will if God exists and foreknows everything that we will ever do? The Free Will Show provides a beginner-friendly introduction to the topic of free will, while at the same time exposing listeners to cutting-edge developments on the topic. Hosted by a couple of philosophers, Taylor Sear and Matt Flummer, the Free Will Show features interviews with guests on a diverse array of issues relating to free will, including issues in science and theology. And our website is thefreewillshow.com. And we also have social media for the Free Will Show. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook page, Instagram, everything's at The Free Will Show.
That was so beautifully written.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're amazing, Taylor.
Thank you. Don't boost my ego too much.
All right. So we are going to be talking about philosophy, but because I think you mentioned this just a minute ago, the topic of free will, at least one of the reasons why I think we're both interested in it, is that it's like a cross section of all of these different issues, academic issues,
Yeah,
practical issues,
right.
that you end up having to learn about a lot of different kinds of things in order to learn about free will. So, although we're both philosophers, we will be talking about some science and theology as well.
Right.
So, do you want to say a little bit about what philosophy is, and
Yeah, that would be
I'll
good.
add a little bit as you go.
Yeah. It's sometimes hard for people to get a handle on what it is that philosophers do. I know when I tell people that I'm a philosopher, I can sometimes get quizzical looks because that sounds like something you shouldn't do as a profession nowadays. That sounds like people walking around in togas in ancient Greece or something. Uh, so maybe the best way to get a handle on it is to start with just examples of questions in philosophy or philosophical issues. So here are a couple of classic philosophical issues or questions. What does it take for a belief to count as knowledge? Do we have knowledge? What counts as knowledge? Or here's another one. What's the nature of human persons? Right? What are we? How do we persist through time? What makes us the same person over time? These are all questions about human persons that are part of philosophy. One from ethics. Is morality objective? Does morality just depend on what people believe about morality, or is it objective? Is it independent of what people think about it? And then, of course, here's a good philosophical question. Do we have free will? And what is free
Absolutely.
will anyway? Yeah.
What is it
So
anyway?
maybe you could talk about some of the different ways of kind of trying to explain what philosophy is now that we have some examples on the table.
Yeah, I like to when I'm teaching an introduction to philosophy class to students who mostly have no idea, they accidentally signed up because they thought they were signing up for psychology or something.
Right, right.
Um, I try to explain it with a little bit of history, where at least in Western ideas where philosophy comes from, there was a way of explaining things in ancient history that appealed to supernatural forces. So the classic example would be Homer,
Hmm.
the Iliad and the Odyssey, or Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, whatever your favorite is. And
Nice.
in order to explain everyday phenomenon like why their crops failed or why they lost the battle, they would say, "Oh, well, the god was that is responsible for that, whether it's the crops or the battle, was unhappy with us because we didn't say the right prayers or give the right sacrifices or whatever. And when good stuff happens, the gods favored them. So they explained it was it had explanatory power in a certain way. And at a certain point, people started to give non supernatural answers to the kinds of questions that they were asking. And these first people they called philosophers, or we could call philosophers. So a way of thinking about the world rationally. So instead of looking for some kind of God that's responsible for why something happens, you look for a reason why something happens.
Yeah, that's a helpful way to put it. And they were called philosophers. I mean, in ancient Greece, this is where we get the term philosopher or philosophy. It comes from this Greek word or compound word, philosophia, which literally translates love of wisdom. So the idea is pursuing wisdom, maybe reasons or explanations through reason.
Yeah. So I guess that leads one way of defining philosophy would be to think very carefully about these kinds of questions and try to give reason or evidence and reasons for them instead of just an ad hoc story.
Right. Yeah, and usually people think of philosophy as addressing sort of the big questions, right? I gave examples
Yeah.
about what counts as knowledge or what, about morality, whether it's objective or not, whether we have free will. So these are issues that are typically taken to be important. They're certainly fundamental in a certain sense, right? We like use these concepts like knowledge and free will, morality all the time. We rely on them implicitly. We could hardly do without them, but we often sort of take them for granted, don't make them explicit.
Yeah,
But then the
absolutely.
philosopher comes along and raises important questions about these topics that people hadn't really thought about before.
Yeah.
Yeah, so how does a philosopher do philosophy, and how is it different from the tools that people in other disciplines use? Maybe we could contrast philosophy with the hard sciences.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I like to do this contrast because most people know what science is and what it involves because we live in a culture that's very science heavy, or um, I don't know what the right word for that is. We like science,
Yeah,
and
we're
so
pro science,
we're
unless
from
you're Joe Bluth in Arrested Development, who thinks the jury's still out on science. But most of us,
right,
most
right.
of
But
us care about science.
for the rest of us, it's really important to our daily lives. Like I'm really glad that the scientists discovered that the friction from brakes makes your car stop when it needs to stop. But so
Yeah, I'm
we
pro
are,
brakes.
yeah, we are familiar, at least in a general sense, of what scientists do. The scientist forms a hypothesis and then tests that hypothesis with some kind of observation or experimentation.
Right.
And in philosophy, we also form a hypothesis, but we don't necessarily test it in the same way that scientists do. Our tools, or our main the main thing that we use, are arguments in philosophy.
Arguments, huh? That sounds like it could get heated.
Yes, absolutely. That's always the caveat that you have to make when you explain this, is that we're going to be using terms that are not the same way that we use the term in everyday language.
That's fair.
Yeah, so why don't, you mentioned that whether
Yeah,
arguments are heated discussions. So why don't
right.
you give your definition of an argument?
Right, sure. It's a perfectly fine way to use the word argument to talk about some kind of heated dispute between people that are upset with each other. Uh, People have arguments all the time in that sense. But yeah, when philosophers give arguments or um, reason, if you want to just use that term instead, what they're doing is giving you reasons to believe some claim. So typically, an argument is a series of sentences or claims, one of which is the conclusion, and then the rest of which are premises. And ideally, if it's a good argument, the premises will give you some reason to accept the conclusion. So, what philosophers try to do is present questions evaluate concepts and then to give arguments in favor of particular views, or in some cases against other views, on these fundamental issues like about morality and knowledge and free will and all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess we should say something about thought experiments too.
Yeah. So we have experiments in science where I do these with my kids sometimes. Like the making a volcano with baking soda and vinegar, and then we talk about acids and bases, and we can do experiments that are repeatable and explain what's going to happen when you add the acid to the base. Thought experiments are supposed to function in a similar way, right? How would you explain that? Um,
Yeah. I guess a lot of times the premises of arguments that philosophers give, the way that they try to support them is by inviting readers, listeners to think about an imaginary case, right? And it could be close to real life or it could be something from fiction, but often philosophers will sort of tinker their imagined scenario to suit their particular purposes, and then they'll ask you, the listener, what do you think about this case? So a classic example that many people will have heard about by now is the trolley problem. So imagine that you're standing next to this trolley track and you see a trolley who's, with failed brakes headed down this track, and there's no way to stop it, and straight ahead of the trolley are five innocent people who are stuck on the tracks and who will be killed by the trolley if nothing happens, no one intervenes. You are standing next to the track, can pull this lever that'll divert the trolley down a side rail. You'll save these five people, but there's one innocent person stuck on the track over there. And so someone's going to die no matter what you do or don't do. And the question is, what should you do? Should you let the trolley go the way it's going without your intervention, killing five people, or should you pull the lever, save those five people, but kill one other innocent person? A lot of people think, well, I'll just put it this way: it doesn't really matter what people think about that in that particular case. You can use a thought experiment like that. Hopefully, that's never been a real scenario, although with autonomous vehicles, there are versions of the trolley scenario that are real life. But anyway, we can ask, what do we learn from thinking about that kind of case? Do we learn anything about whether killing to save a greater number is ever permissible? We could ask all sorts of questions about that kind of case. That's an example of a thought experiment.
yeah, I love that. I love that example. That's a very good explanation. I don't know if I could add anything to that other than the thought experiments can be used in different ways in different parts of arguments. I don't know.
Right.
I've already forgotten what you said. I'm sorry. No, I'm
Yeah, I
kidding.
guess I
Um,
mentioned that you could use it to sort of support a premise. So if like one of your
yeah,
premises was that, yeah, if it was like, if the premise said that it's never okay to kill one person to save five or something like
yeah,
that,
that would
you
be a
could
great
use it.
thought experiment to
Yeah,
falsify that premise. That was the
perhaps,
thing I was thinking of.
perhaps.
Yeah, but yeah, it would at least get the ball rolling.
Right,
To where when somebody makes a claim, you come up with a. Sometimes they're called counterexamples, but they're kind of like thought experiments. So you're like, think about this case to see if it works as a counterexample, and we use that term counterexample as an example that shows that's counter to your principle or
right,
your claim that shows that it's false. So they
right.
can be used in different ways.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, they can even be used just to sort of elucidate that there is a question in the area. I mean, I think of
yeah,
like this famous case from, or I don't even know if you want to call it a thought experiment. I think of it as a thought experiment from Plato's Republic, sometimes called the allegory of the cave, where he's imagining a scenario that's supposed to tell you a little bit about our situation with respect to knowledge, with the human
yeah,
condition. So it could just sort of, might not be an argument or part of an argument. It could just be a way of depicting a question.
cool. Yes. Maybe the one more thing that I would like to, or at least I like to explain to people what philosophy is. We've talked about big questions, we've talked about arguments, we've talked about thought experiments. But if you look at the history of philosophy, a lot of the questions that were asked that were philosophical questions a long time ago,
Hmm.
we count as science now. And the way Bertrand Russell explains it in his great book, The Problems of Philosophy, is that once we have a certain kind of question and we gain some kind of definite knowledge about that question, then it ceases to become philosophy and becomes its own branch of science. So an example of that might be philosophy of mind, where out of philosophy of mind came the branches of science that we call psychology and maybe neuroscience. I don't know, but there's
Interesting.
other examples of that
Right.
throughout the
Surely,
history of
in
science.
if you go far enough back, there's a blend of what we now think of as philosophy and physics and
Oh yeah, yeah.
mathematics. You have the
That's what Aristotle
Pythagoreans
was
and
doing, right?
Aristotle. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah. So Aristotle was asking questions about the natural world, which we would call science now, but back when he was doing it, it was called philosophy.
Yeah. He did call one of his books Physics.
He did.
Maybe that's where we got it.
Maybe.
The one other thing I like to say is a little bit about kind of how philosophy pertains to everything else. So, I mean, we're going to get at a bunch of ways in which philosophy is practical, but even just in a sort of theoretical, academic setting, philosophy sort of bears on all sorts of other subjects. So I like to tell my students that for any X, where let X stand for any field of inquiry like science, religion, law, business, even art, right? There's a philosophy of X. So, you could take whole courses on philosophy of law or philosophy of religion. I have taken those courses. They're very good. You can take business ethics courses. Aesthetics is this area of philosophy that has to do with art. There, there's not just philosophy of science in general. There's philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology in particular. So, for any field, because philosophy asks fundamental questions about any area of inquiry, there's going to be some set of philosophical issues or even presuppositions about other fields. So there's going to be some way that philosophy is related, or at least could be related to that field.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Even
guess,
philosophy of philosophy,
yeah, yeah, there is meta philosophy.
believe it or not.
Yeah. Maybe we should say very quickly what the main branches of philosophy are, just so that listeners who are unfamiliar with philosophy have a sense for how to kind of think about the areas of philosophy. So we
Yeah.
kind of touched on each of these already, but I like to think of philosophy as being three main branches. Maybe you can
Hmm.
add on this if you think there's more to add, but there's epistemology, which has to do with knowledge or belief. So the question about when a belief counts as knowledge is an epistemological question. Um, there's lots of other issues in epistemology related to rationality and when a belief is justified or warranted, that sort of thing. There's the second main branch, metaphysics, which is notoriously difficult to pin down, but it's something like the study of the fundamental nature of reality. So, sort of beyond what we do in the sciences, including physics. So, questions in metaphysics include, you know, questions about what exists. That's sometimes called ontology. So, does God exist? So, naturalism versus supernaturalism. There's questions about what we are, what human persons are. There's questions about personal identity over time. Hinted at those earlier. Usually, questions about free will, at least whether we have free will in a certain sense, is a metaphysical question. Um, and then I'll just say the third branch, and then you can fill in or ask questions about these. So the third main branch is, I like to think of it as value theory, very sort of broadly construed. A lot of people think of it as ethics, but it'll include things like political philosophy, maybe aesthetics, questions about morality, about how to live a good life, right and wrong. These are all questions that are related to values. So we call that value theory.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I think that's probably the best way of there's probably a lot of different ways. You ask
Sure,
different philosophers, they're going to give you different answers for how you should categorize the branches of philosophy.
definitely.
But this is the three branches that I usually use when I explain it too. Where would you put logic in with this?
I
This
was
is one
just going to
question I
say,
have.
yeah, because we're using logic in all, in doing philosophy, no matter which of these other areas, is sort of permeates the others. But you can also study logic itself, and that seems separate from these other three things. So maybe that should be a
Yeah.
fourth branch.
Yeah, because I took a graduate seminar on the philosophy of logic, and we were talking about metaphysics,
Right.
like what logic is,
Right.
and like what's the fundamental nature of logic.
Right.
But you could probably also put it in different categories too, depending on what kind of questions that you're asking. But it's
Yes.
also this other thing that is outside of the categories that you use in these categories or branches.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's also in a lot of people's minds this idea that the study of the history of philosophy is somehow different from like doing epistemology, metaphysics, value theory, right? Working with the views that other philosophers have defended about all these other topics. So sometimes people think of history of philosophy as a separate branch of philosophy.
Yeah,
But
that makes sense because you might be asking different kinds of questions, and it's more
right,
of the historical questions that you're asking, like what this person thought or said, or how is it best to interpret these passages in whatever language it is.
right. Yeah, and so for lots of issues, so take philosophy of religion or take um, I don't know, an issue, a particular topic in philosophy like free will. These topics, these sort of subdisciplines, might cut across the main branches of philosophy. So you could ask questions about religious epistemology, about whether God exists. Those would be epistemology and metaphysics, but also both in philosophy of religion. When you're asking about free will, you could be asking how we could know that we have free will, what free will is, metaphysically speaking, why free will is valuable, right? So these are just
Hmm.
way you can think of the main branches of philosophy to sort of help you get a sense for the types of things that philosophers do. It's one way of characterizing it, but of course, not all topics fit neatly to just one of the categories or branches.
Yeah, that's one of the so free will does this. Philosophy of religion is kind of like this too. This is one of the reasons why I was interested in philosophy of religion, because it covers all of these different categories.
Right,
So if you have questions about whether or not God exists, that's a metaphysical question. But there's also epistemological questions like how could we even know whether God exists?
right.
And it kind of crosses categories too.
Even the problem of evil, it raises questions that come up in value theory,
Yeah.
even in trying to settle a sort of metaphysical question about what exists.
Hmm.
Yeah,
All right, so we've
yeah.
talked about a lot of the types, what philosophy is, different branches of philosophy. Let's move on to talk a little bit about how the podcast episodes will be organized. We have organized the topics within free will into what we're going to be calling seasons. And an example of that is free will and determinism, free will, divine foreknowledge, free will and science. So tell us what the first season is going to be.
Yeah, the first season will be a sort of introductory season. So ideally, if you had listened to the first season before jumping into any of the others, you'd have really a solid background into the sort of fundamental issues and questions in debates about free will. So each of the seasons will probably have 8 or 10 episodes, sometimes less, sometimes more, perhaps, but a manageable number. The first season will introduce why we should care about free will, questions about free will and determinism, other threats to free will, these sorts of basic questions about free will, and then some of the main positions in debates about free will, just to sort of provide listeners with some bearings before getting into more particular topics in later seasons. I guess we should say, even though at this stage we've planned some, we haven't recorded very much, we could switch things up, but the ordering of the seasons wouldn't matter after season one. So you could jump around. You could, if you're interested in divine foreknowledge, you could listen to that season before you listen to a season about free will and determinism or free will and science, or vice versa. And
Yeah.
we're talking about doing something special at the end of each season. Why don't you say something about that, Matt?
Something special.
Something special.
at the end of each
Q&A.
season. Oh,
Q&A
yeah,
with
yeah,
listeners. We were so
yeah. I
excited about
totally
this.
forgot that we had planned on doing that. So there, we hope that people will listen and have questions as we go, and we will be accepting questions on different social media platforms. If you have some kind of question that you want us to answer, then you can ask away. I'm not guaranteeing that we will have an answer for that question, because we're talking about philosophy and some of these questions maybe don't have answers, but we will have a response. So I don't know if you want to call it the question and answer episode or the question and response episode.
Sure. We will consider your questions.
You put me on
Great.
the spot there. Like, that's not in the show notes, and you asked me a question and I didn't know the answer.
I snuck it in the show notes. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So
Okay, well, this shouldn't be a surprise. Yeah, why are we doing
why
this?
why in the world, what do we need a new podcast for, and especially one about free will? I
Well,
think
as far as
the
I can
answer that
tell,
you when we first started talking about this, you were like, "Hey, there's no podcast on free will," and so we're
that's
like,
exactly right.
"Oh, okay, that's a good reason to make a podcast on free will."
I love reading and writing about free will, and I was really hoping to listen to something about free will. I went searching for one, and there's a handful of episodes of other podcasts here and there about free will, but there's nothing devoted to free will. So there's a need for it, I think. I think it would be helpful for listeners, and I think it's even going to be helpful for me sort of parsing through this stuff, just to have an accessible introduction to thinking about free will for anyone who's interested.
Yeah,
Might be a benefit to philosophers, to students of philosophy in particular, but hopefully it'll be accessible to anyone who's interested in the topic.
yeah. One of the other things I'm excited about making this is there's a lot of cutting edge work in some of these debates within free will that's being done right now,
Right,
especially with the overlaps from other disciplines like within neuroscience and psychology.
right.
That's really interesting stuff that I would love to get caught up on and highlight some of the work that some of these people are doing.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I guess we haven't really said anything about this, although it'll be obvious if people have listened to other episodes. Our plan is to have an interview, to have a guest on for each episode, and to interview someone about the topic in question. So in some cases, we'll just ask people who are working on free will what they're working on. But in other cases, we'll talk through some subject with them, even if they're not working on it, something that they're an expert on, even if they're not writing something on it right then.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other reason I wanted to make this is because it just sounded fun. We're friends. I like talking to you about free will, Matt. Maybe some other people will enjoy listening in, since we'll have fun doing it.
Yeah, I agree. I can talk. I think that's the problem with philosophy is you can talk about it for so long. Like my plumber friend who helped me install a valve on my well. I was kind of apologetic because I can't help him as much as he can help me. And he's like, "That's all right, man. I just like talking to you." I'm like, "Well, that's one thing I can do. I can talk." I pretty much get paid to talk to undergrad students for hours.
There you go. And since you have a microphone now, more people can listen to you
Yeah.
talk.
In theory,
In theory,
allegedly.
it'll be physically possible.
Yes.
Cool. Well, okay, so that's a little bit about us and about this podcast and why we want to make it. Stay tuned for more episodes.